So good morning. Thank you, Linda, for the incredibly generous introduction and for the inspiring words. So it's quite a fantastic way to start this 3-day conference. So our first request is, it feels a little bit spread out. So if you're at the back, I wonder if we could all move forward a little bit so we can create a more cozy discussion space. This isn't exactly the room that conjures the image of cozy, but we could certainly try to challenge the space itself. So if you're kind of close to the front, that's okay, but if we can, that'd be great. Thank you. It was just some quiet at the back. Dalia's. Wonderful. So thank you so much. I'd like to start by welcoming all of you to the opening roundtable discussion for the GenUrb conference. My name is Lata Narayanaswamy, so I'm a lecturer or assistant professor in international development at the University of Leeds. And it's my great privilege to chair today's roundtable discussion. We have some fantastic speakers, although I understand we have one of our speakers who is on her way from the airport, so we're still hopeful that she's going to make our way, but we're going to get started, and then as and when she comes, we'll be able to, I have no doubt, incorporate her constructively into our discussions. So our opening roundtable has been, I think, quite rightly titled Decolonizing the Urban in a Time of Neocolonialism. And this is very much, and I'm not taking any credit for this framing, I'm just wanting to signal that I really think it's very important and I agree with it. But this question of trying to frame the next 3 days in terms of thinking about urban feminisms and urban feminist futures in terms of critical approaches to power. So thinking about terminologies like gender, resistance, agency, collaboration, solidarity, and feminist epistemologies, and thinking about that in terms of the urban, but also the fluidity of the notions of the urban itself. So to do that, we have some fantastic speakers, and without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each, I'll tell you who they are. We have Grace Adeniyi Ogunyankin from, now you're at Queen's University. We have Amita Bhide from, where'd you go? From Mumbai, from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. We have Faranak Miraftab from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And we have Lorena Zárate from Habitat International Coalition. So what I'll do is I will introduce each speaker. Each speaker will speak for 5 minutes. I have a handy sign here that tells you when 1 minute is left. So we're going to try to keep to time. And then we're going to have questions that will try to link together some of the ideas that you raise. Okay? Okay, so we'll start with Grace. So Grace is an assistant professor of women's and gender studies at Queen's University. So she's a feminist scholar who is interested in placemaking and subjectivity through the study of African urbanisms and popular culture. In her study of African urbanisms, she is primarily intrigued by how local engagement with the Africa Rising rhetoric and global aspects of the political economy work together to reproduce spatial and social inequalities and provoke resistance in African cities.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So we were asked to answer what we think about what decolonizing the urban looks like in neocolonial times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a quote by Ashton Crawley that helps me think about decolonizing the urban. So Ashton Crawley's concept of the otherwise is a way of thinking and acting outside dominant, violent ways of being. And so I will begin the quote now. To begin with the otherwise as word, as concept, is to presume that whatever we have is not all that is possible. Otherwise. It is a concept of internal difference, internal multiplicity. The otherwise is a disbelief in what is current and a movement towards an affirmation of imagining other modes of social organization, other ways for us to be with each other, otherwise as plenitude. Otherwise is an enunciation and concept of irreducible possibility, irreducible capacity to create change, to be something else, to explore, to imagine, to live fully, freely, vibrantly. Otherwise Ferguson, otherwise Gaza, otherwise Detroit, otherwise worlds. Otherwise expresses an unrest and discontent, a seeking to conceive dreams that allow us to wake laughing, tears of joy in our eyes, dreams that have us saying, I hope this comes true. So when I think about decolonizing the urban, that's where I start from. Especially if we think of all the scholars like Bignolo who have talked about decoloniality as delinking from the overall structure of knowledge in order to engage in epistemic reconstitution. So because I also do work on popular culture, I'm very much influenced by artists like Olaleka and Jayafis, and I figure it's better to put this picture here than to talk about the picture so that way you can all see it. So because I do work on the African urban, particularly Nigeria, and a lot of African cities are trying to become world class. And a lot of these projects also challenge colonial ways of purifying African cities, of marking black bodies as being other, of marking black spaces on the continent as not being part of the world. So a lot of these projects are also, in a way, counter-narratives. But my challenge is what happens when we try to engage in these counter-narratives, these projects of counter-narratives, in ways that end up aligning with these familiar orientations of, the geographical determinism of, colonialism, and that stays that this is the way things should be. So that's where I'm coming from. So with this particular artist, he's not necessarily saying that this is what the urban future should look like, but he's saying, so the first picture to your left this is on Lagos Island. So Lagos Island is one of the more upscale, rich spaces. So what he's done is he's put shanty megastructures there to say, what happens when you keep producing these urban futures without thinking about marginalized spaces and marginalized bodies in mind? So what he's saying is, when we think about the urban future, it doesn't have to be about particular ways of knowing that tells us that, oh, you have to have these kind of high rises, you have to look this particular way. So that's where I'm coming from when I think about what it means to decolonize the urban. And of course, for all of you who've seen Black Panther, there's also that. So when I think about spaces of inclusion, of including, okay. So this, when I saw Black Panther, this particular scene spoke to me because I saw the African marketplaces that I'm used to. And when I think about all these projects of neoliberal urbanism, they're trying to get rid of these spaces, this speaks to me that you can have modern technology and you can still embrace the cultural and the heritage. You can include everybody. You can have different flows within the city. So to me, that's what it means to decolonize the urban as we think about the future.
Thank you, Grace. That is fantastic. I hadn't thought about Black Panther in quite that way. So, and it's important because obviously we take for granted pop culture references. So I think that's a fantastic connection to make. So thank you for that. Okay, so now I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Amita Bhide, currently Dean and Professor in the School of Habitat Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. She has extensively researched urban local governance and planning, water and sanitation, housing and land issues. She attempts to develop a theoretical and action model of urbanization that is relevant for the global south through an engagement with several transformative groups at the city, provincial and national scales. The geographic focus of her work is Mumbai, while more recent engagement is with small and medium towns.
Thanks, Lata. I'm going to start with thinking about what actually colonization means for me before talking about decolonization. And I think the experience in India of colonization was not in some ways as clear-cut as we talked about in terms of the racist question between the white and black. But in India, it is a much more diverse, a very, very deep experience. And just some of the things and facets of this colonial experience are imposed economic, political, cultural processes, a thinking about a built environment, laws, institutions which are all structured around particular kinds of exclusions, and a process therefore of building a material culture of city formation itself, which is deeply divided and exclusionary. These exclusions that I'm talking about are actually also not only a colonial force, but they are made with the co-option of the local elite. So which means that there is a colonizer which is created internally within the country, and within each institution, within every law. And while one may see, so there is a very popular kind of song which is used among several transformative activists, which says, "Gore hakim gayo re bhaiya, aage hakim kale, badal gayi hai chabi lekin badle nahi hai tali." What this says is that while the white rulers have gone, there are new black, or rather brown, or whatever you may say, shade rulers who have come in. The keys have changed, but the locks haven't. And this actually represents the continuity of colonial traditions, institutions, processes, which have carried mostly also into that post-colonial talk or rhetoric that we have had for a long time. And now, with neoliberalism, the overlaps of this process with the erstwhile colonial process become even more stronger. So the kind of inequalities that we are talking about today take the shape of, we may have in a city like Mumbai some of the world's most rich people who are staying, and at the same time we also have malnourishment rates in certain areas which are almost equivalent to sub-Saharan Africa. So it is these kind of deep divides which one is talking of as colonization, and which is a very, very contemporary process. How does one decolonize? To me, then, decolonization actually means posing a challenge at all of these levels. It is talking about the real political economy. How does one transform that? It is talking about legislations. It is talking about institutions and the deeply embedded exclusionary culture within them. And it is also talking about the practices and the sheer everydayness through which both the hegemony of all of these practices is produced, but there is also a challenge to these things which is produced. And therefore, how does one bring in transformation from the everyday to these real world practices. That is the challenge of the decolonizing process. It would perhaps mean keep thinking about how does one break away from the entire homogenization of what a world-class city, urbanization process means. So many labels which are being constantly exported. World-class city, smart city, slum-free city. So these are the connotations which kind of show a continuity within Indian cities, and how to accept a diversity of the urbanization experience that is actually possible. I also think one needs to build a continuity from thinking about practices and today I think in all our cities there exists a huge culture of informality, which is as much, I would say, a production of hegemony as it is perhaps a challenge to it. So how does one kind of think about informality and thinking about transformative practices within that informality would also, I think, be a huge challenge in terms of.
Thank you, Amita. That's really thoughtful. And actually the thing that was so striking was the way that you layered that, but also introducing a non-English language. I'm struck by the fact that actually we tend to operate in English. That's an issue very close to my heart. Bringing poetry, but also other languages into the space is also a really valuable way to start. So thank you so much for doing that. Okay, so I'd like now to introduce Faranak Miraftab. I hope I've said that correctly. Okay. Faranak is an associate professor of urban and Professor, absolutely, professor, fantastic. Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And her work has three interconnected themes: emerging trends in governance and the ways in which the state-society relations are managed and governed, community-based activism and the ways in which grassroots mobilize to claim their right to urban livelihood and resources, and transnational and translocal practices and processes that shape globalization from below.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I will stay with you 5 minutes ago. Before I start my response, I wanted to acknowledge a very important critique of decolonization and the conversations about decolonizing raised by Eve Talk and Wayne Yacht that wrote that article titled "Decolonization is not a metaphor." And their critique was that we sometimes use decolonizing this and decolonizing that, decolonizing thought, decolonizing education as a way of then overpassing the deeper, conversation about decolonizing. When for indigenous people this has been dispossession and basically a project of repatriation for the original sin that was taking their land away and dispossessing and displacing indigenous people. So I acknowledge that very important critique that we cannot talk about decolonizing education, decolonizing thought without or as a way of ignoring the deeper, more important, I can't say more important, but very important demand or claim by indigenous people, which is recognizing their dispossession and displacement. So I recognize that critique and take it very seriously in the conversation that we are having now and for the rest of the conference. But I also want to stress, having recognized the original sin, let's say, we have to also explore what are the frontiers of this colonization, continued process of colonization. So if it's an original form of it was, and the way it took place was grabbing land and taking people and slaves and resources and all of that, that was the frontier of colonization in that form of it. What has been the continued forms of colonization and where have been the frontiers? Maria Mies and colleagues, I think it was late 1980s, wrote a book called Women, the Last Colony. And they talked about, okay, the frontier of colonization now is grabbing the cheap labor of women. So labor force, feminized labor force was, they identified it as this new colony, that now colonizers could basically use the cheap labor force of women in the production realm in global south or wherever, and that was what they called the last colony or the frontiers of colonization. I want to provoke here that maybe what is now at this moment we should see as the frontier of this current era of colonization is future. And let me explain that. What I mean by future as being the site of fierce contestation for colonization and decolonization. If you see, okay, future is basically inevitable. There's no way to avoid it. It's also open. It can be anything, it can be many things, and it's plural. And because of its openness and its unpredictability, future is object of intense dispute, and it's object of political, it's a political territory basically that is site and subject of fierce contestations over the content it can take. So if we don't imagine future in a different way, it will be a continuation, a perpetuation of what it is today. And that is how I think we have to think about it is future that is subject of this struggle over its content and its shape and what it would be. And if Margaret Thatcher famously taught declared it as there is no alternative to what we have today, that was precisely trying to bring a closure to, don't even bother about thinking something different about future. And that is what I see as the frontier of our struggle to decolonize future. And if we want to decolonize that terrain, basically by saying, okay, maybe Fukuyama says this is the end of history, right? But the end of history as we know it could be the beginning of another history as we want it to be. And the key to that is imagination. So if you ask, the next question for me would be, so where do we look for inspiration for opening up our imaginations of an alternative future? Where do we look for those alternatives? And I can come back to that. But I wanted to just put that imagination of alternative urban futures is really where I see the frontier of colonization and decolonization struggle that today we are dealing with. Thank you.
I also would thank you, Faranak, because that Chuck and Yang article is excellent on that basis, and certainly being in the UK in academia at the minute, I do see that word being used quite a lot to describe all sorts of things. So I think thinking about how we use that language, the nuance that we associate with that language is a really important thing for us to keep in mind. So that's a very valuable sort of contribution as a framing thing for the day, so thank you for that. I would now like, and also fantastic that you made it. Brilliant. Toronto traffic is famously, so the airline, okay, so there's lots of things going on. But you're here, fantastic. So are you okay if I introduce you? Happy to go, fantastic, okay. So, absolutely wonderful to be able to welcome, literally off the plane, Dalia Wahdan, a professor at Nile University and a former associate professor at anthropology. Getting it all mixed up, it's important to get it right. The Foundation for Liberal and Management Education at Pune, India. And she specializes in urban studies and public policies, and has a growing list of peer-reviewed academic publications, including the book Planning Egypt's New Settlements, The Politics of Spatial Inequities by Oxford University Press. Her extra academic engagements include institutional capacity building for public agencies and non-governmental organizations in Egypt and the Gulf states. So you'll have that 5 minutes, and then when you have 1 minute, I'll let you know.
In fact, this introduction is correct until last May, where I spent most of my time critiquing architects and urban designers. All of a sudden, I'm now teaching at Nile University Department of Architecture and Urban Design. So, in fact, when I received this invitation, I was really happy because I'm working on a project on unsafe areas in Egypt, and this project has actually hit me with the amount of biases and violence on multiple scales, even violence against architects, violence between architects and the people. I framed my introduction today on the possibility of decolonizing the urban through looking at everyday practices and identities, everyday multiple identities, the built environment, architecture, and urban design, and what's going on in Egypt at the moment, public policies, of course, if we can still use the term public policy, and pedagogical issues in reference to architecture, art, and design. And of course, I'm trying to find the key, how to decolonize. I've been working for 2 years now in Egypt, and of the amount and nature and magnitude of brutalities and violence against urban dwellers coming from outside Cairo or from within Cairo is hilarious. And I'm particularly interested in also the reorganization and restructuring that's taking place in urban spaces in Cairo at the moment, especially with this 21st century real estate frenzy. It's indeed a frenzy. Whether we're talking about evictions, forced or negotiated, whether we're talking about how demolitions take place, simple demolitions and the amount of money that comes out of demolitions for local authorities, and the imperative of getting revenues as fast as it can be. And also something quite interesting, which is the fact that the president declared that any attempt to upgrade informal or unplanned settlements or the so-called unsafe areas will not get money from the public or the national budget. It will get its funds from 3 very interesting sources. The first one is the surplus of LUCA, which is the primary agency responsible for building new capitals and new cities in the desert and mega projects. So if they make enough profit, they can actually give some to the... The second is the 25% from the real estate taxes, which also means that if any upgrading would take place, it will depend on the capacities of the government to generate property taxes. And the third is the sale of commercial units. When all 3 put together, it made me realize that the fate of unplanned or informal settlements or slums is actually tied immediately and very tightly to the capacity of the economy, the urban economy, to transform into a real estate financial market. And it is as fast as it can be. So the more we can generate real estate, the more we can have a rate of returns, the more we will have the so-called upgrading. So upgrading will, in the near future, will always be violence, evictions, demolitions, and homelessness. It will never be what they have said upgrading. So, and the complicity of architects and urban designers that I've been dealing with for the past 2, I wouldn't say everybody. There are, of course, attempts, but the attempts are very humble, and definitely they are not on the mainstream. This actually made me question whether these attempts to parallel built environment is actually going to decolonize the urban. I thought that maybe the key to decolonization would be, number 1, if we look at the everyday practices and how the people or the dwellers of the unsafe areas now have turned into their old, I would call as an anthropologist, parochial identities. And the consolidation of these kinds of identities against local, what Professor Amita has been saying, even local colonizers. As I said, demolitions make a lot of money for local contractors. So they've turned into a power any group. And I asked myself, do you think that if we go to these kinds of parochial or identities or local identities, is this going to give us a better or equitable, I'm fine. Okay, is it going to be an equitable future? Is it going to decolonize the urban? In fact, I said no so far, but I can give only three things. One is, I think if we are as anthropologists or as urban designers to decolonize the urban, one, we have to reclaim dignity, because the amount of violence is quite striking and crass. Two is capturing freedom, is actually taking architecture back into art, and urban design back into art and freedom. And the other thing is celebrating local defiance, however, with an eye to equities. And the last thing, pedagogical, is actually a retrieval or conjuring parallel histories. And we can discuss that later. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And also just drawing out the parallels. It's very clear that formal, informal, and that perhaps that's something we can discuss after everybody's had a chance to speak, because I think perhaps that is one of the key dividing lines in a way in thinking about colonial legacies, certainly in relation to questions of land as well, and who gets to be where they are and who doesn't. That legality actually isn't something that is, it's not neutral, is it, at all? So we'll definitely revisit that. So thank you, that's been really, really thought-provoking. And last but by no means least, we have Lorena Zárate, currently president of Habitat International Coalition. She was regional coordinator of HIC Latin America office and has been involved in the elaboration and dissemination of the World Charter on the Right to the City. So again, I'm sure you'll have more to say about these sorts of dividing lines, and the consultation process to define the Mexico City Human Rights Program and the Promoting Committee for the elaboration of the Mexico City Charter for the Right to the City.
Thank you. Gracias. Buenos días. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to share this very challenging and thought-provoking panel. Thank you, of course, to the organizers, in particular Professor Linda Peak, and also Liam for all the terrific work they put together to have us today here at this fantastic conference. So I have actually the privilege of being the last one of this first round of introductions, and I want to highlight a few things that we believe and we feel they're actually the path forward. I think there's a lot of discussion and knowledge, of course, how we get here and why we get here. But now it's the opening of the future that is hanging, and the future is actually now, right? It's not something that is going to happen in 20 years, in particular if we keep destroying the planet as we are doing today. So the future is today, right? So a couple of things. First of all, I think introducing poetry. Introducing poetry is introducing language. Introducing language is introducing culture. And it's introducing the way we see, we perceive, we live, and we transform or not the worlds we have, right? Different worlds we have. So I think it's by no means just an arbitrary thing, or certainly not at all a superficial thing to do. So let's think about that, and let's think about how different cultures in different places used to have poetry much more present than we have today, right? And we can do maybe a contraposition with technology, although it's not really quite fair. But technology is over-present in our lives, right? Everywhere, every single minute of our life. And so everything is about technology, and everything is about actually the future, in that sense of very technological and very futuristic imaginaries that are actually all the same. And I'm glad you presented those pictures at the beginning, because having the possibility to be in different conferences, all over the place, is really striking how, in particular, public officials, both at local level and national level, when they discuss about the urban futures and the cities they want to transform and part of their plans, they all look the same, don't they? they all look the same. So we have a huge problem if we cannot imagine different pictures, because imagining the future is actually imagining different pictures and visions. And those are colonizing our minds every single day. So please start creating those images, right? Because that's actually the possibility of building different things. But also, it's looking at the past. And my background at university was in history, so I cannot, help bringing history, having history all the time in me and in my thinking. I think, of course, these are relative terms. We all know, right? What is the past? What is the present? What is the future? It's all moving on all the time, right? And the past is present today, and the future is present today. So, that doesn't mean much if we don't actually think about it and deconstruct that and reconstruct that. So bringing poetry and the past also, I will bring a little phrase that Eduardo Galeano, the famous Uruguayan writer, mentioned once, and it's a phrase that he actually was taken from indigenous peoples in the Amazonas, in the Amazonia. So the phrase in Spanish is, tenemos mucho pasado por delante, which is actually a very hard phrase to translate. So I know there are many people here that speak Spanish and English and probably other languages, so you can help me translate that later on. But a quick version, simple version of that poetic would be, we, that's the first one, we. That's a collective one. And let me just say that many peoples in many different places have actually different ways and different words to say and to mean we. It's not just one we, there are different we's in the same languages, right? So this is an important one. So let's think about the we. We have a lot of past ahead of us, right? So I think we have a few things to work on that. Three quick mentions and then we can keep going. So how we actually translate that into concrete things, right? Or more concrete everyday things. And you also mentioned here, if we want to be quite simplistic, the material level of that, so dispossessing land, etc., right? And economic issues, but also the ideological level. And we all know this is an ideological battle. We all know that, right? So in that, I think three things, and we can discuss these with concrete examples. Going beyond the binaries, right? The imposed binaries that we have on our way of thinking and analyzing things. And in particular, three levels. These formal, informal binaries, right? The legal, illegal binaries, and also the urban-rural binaries. And of course, we can take many, many, many more. So decolonizing that way of thinking, I think it's decolonizing those binaries that are very artificial, they're not very, transformative, and they're actually imposing on us, like very simplistic ways of understanding things and actually to punish things and to favor other things, right? So this is very important. And the other big category, of course, is decommodifying. Decommodifying, yeah? Is that a word in English, actually? Desmercantilizar, right? Decommodifying life. And of course, that's very much linked with the feminist, and not just women's, everyday life and ways of thinking life, but feminist approach to everything in our life, right? In our society. So that's related with care. Decommodifying is also related with care and caring societies and caring cities at every single level. So I think those are a few things that we might continue discussing on this 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorena. That was also fantastic because you took the time to make the link with the other speakers. I think there's plenty of overlap and commonality. My task is now to try to ask questions and bring some of these ideas together to facilitate a discussion amongst our speakers. I'd like to start that, if that's okay, by actually thinking about this question of colonialism, decolonizing, and neocolonialism. So if we can start with the sort of title. And the language of decolonial rather than post-colonial is an explicit acknowledgement that we still exist with the historical legacies of colonial enterprise, as it were. But obviously the language of neocolonialism in its own way poses a challenge. And I wonder if, as panelists, you could reflect for us on the potential implications of the continuity or the discontinuity between that colonial past and this neo-colonial present. So in thinking about making sense of what coloniality means for us in our discourse and our practice, maybe putting some, having a bit more depth of understanding around that disjuncture, I think could be very valuable. And I think, Amita, you've already started doing some of that in thinking through sort of elites in these spaces. But I think that would be a really wonderful starting point in really actually tackling the title for our opening session and thinking about that in more depth. And then the implications for how we frame the gendered experience of the urban. So that's kind of a lot. I'm really happy for you to sort of say whatever you want about that. Are you happy if we just go along, or do you want to jump in? What would, is that okay? Do you want to go first? I mean, that's you're next to me.
Okay, it's an extremely provocative question, and thanks for that, Lata. So I think in my first version, I already layered what I think of the colonization process. And in terms of looking at these binaries that you talked about, I very much agree that the roots of thinking about urbanization process itself, which is so very violent, so very composed of many imposed ideas, as opposed to, it is not as if there were no urbanization processes which were happening in several of these countries, but you have a very different process which is here imposed. Now, thinking about that kind of idea of urbanization linked to colonization, and I think there was a very interesting period which is called post-colonial in India, where there was an experimentation with thinking about new towns. And I'm briefly mentioning that here just to bring out the nuance of what we are discussing. And this was in the immediate wake of a post-independence period, in terms of thinking about how we can create a different world, different paradigms of development, and yet within that, the way we thought of new towns was full of carrying. So if in the colonial period, the planning was something which surrounded only parts of the city where the colonizers lived, then our answer was to have more planning, right? And that planning itself then creates cities which are divided. So something which had begun in colonization, post-colonialism actually deepened that entire rift. So there was no real change in the trajectory of either urbanization or in terms of thinking about institutions or in the laws per se. It was actually bringing the state much more in, and the state kind of taking forward this vanguard of doing the urbanization process, a different kind of a vanguard. Now, when we think about contemporary processes of urbanization in India, and I'm speaking from the Indian experience because that is what I'm most familiar with, what we see is a very interesting thing. Number one, I think you talked about rising Africa. So we very much believe that we have arrived in the world. So we will rub shoulders with the world's leadership and etc. Of course, whether there is an ideational leadership, that becomes a different question, right? So in this kind of arrived at thing, poverty in cities is something which is completely invisibilized. On the other hand, we link city to only an issue of prosperity. Okay? And then there are all kinds of binaries which get created. A term like informality is shown, and the way the binary is constructed is that there is no work which is linked to informality. So definitely you need not think about minimum wages, conditions of work, having common workspaces if there is home-based work which is carried out in informal settlements. So instead, informality becomes equated to a term called slum, which is then a homogenized discourse. And what you do about slums, I think echoes very much with me about what your experience in Egypt is all about, where you think about formalizing that into a tides future, to a real estate development, and that is what then our cities are all about. The localness is divorced, and instead the discourse of urbanization becomes more centralized, determined from a national level. Politics is something which also is shown of its content of any kind of transformation, and becomes more and more entrenched with how does one make real estate development possible. So today we have no difference between, so there are many politicians who are developers, there are many developers who are politicians, and it's such a tight overlap that one needs to think about what else is there to politics. Is there any other political content at all? Okay? And I think it is this kind of creation of binaries which I want to actually direct attention to. That binaries, there are new and new binaries which are created, and therefore in addition to what you talked about, Lorena, I would just like to add that there is an ongoing need of reflexivity in order, because binaries are not constant, binaries are being created. Informal settlement was once a very potent challenge, but that potent challenge is being now converted into a I would say it is like the frontier of urbanization in India. You think of a slum, this is where urbanization and new processes of urbanization are happening. So how does one make it transformative once again, pose informality and the principle of it challenging the overall rule of property. So I think those potencies are being lost, and hence how does one introduce reflexivity into this?
Okay, so my thoughts are not as well put together yet as that, but as you were talking, I'm picking up things. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is these binaries, right? And particularly when it comes to the level of the everyday practice, and when you see, when you're living like in the urban or wherever you're living, and you're seeing how other people also live their lives, sometimes there's also the aspirational, right? So on the one hand, what I had talked about earlier is the aspirational in terms of urban planners, politicians in the African context, trying to be this particular type of city, right? Trying to like dismantle these binaries that construct Africa as the other, right? But then at the other end, when I think about some of the urban dwellers that I observe, particularly my new interest in youth and how they think and how they orientate themselves toward the future, particularly marginalized youth, they're also trying to get rid of these binaries of like they don't want to be seen as marginalized, but in trying to like, erase that, they're orienting themselves towards things that, when I think about the future, that's not what we should be orienting ourselves towards. So they're trying to have this middle class life, right? Which then engage in particular forms of consumption, right? So when we now think about what it means to decolonize in neocolonial times, when when foreign interest is at the forefront, when you're trying to bring in investments, it's all again tied to consumption. And you're like, okay, well, one day I'm going to be middle class, but what does this pathway to middle classness look like, right? How does it reproduce these same, these desires for consumption that started the colonial project, that started slavery and all these things, right? So I guess for me, what does it mean to, when I think about all these questions you're asking, and even in terms of, was it you who mentioned the woman as the last, call? Yeah, so even in terms of all those things, what would it mean then to embrace, when we think about sustainability as well, right? The circular economy, what would it mean to just deal with what we have, as opposed to like keep on like looking to further exploit, right? Which is what has brought us to where we are now, right? To exploiting land, exploiting bodies. So, but it's all connected again to the aspirational and consumption and trying to like construct these binaries, deconstruct these binaries. And I don't know if it makes any sense. I'm just gonna pass this on, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the question to remind myself I'm answering the question. What do we think about coloniality, decolonizing and neocolonialism, all of those three together? So this is what I'm thinking about. If colonialism, we know very well that they mastered the art of indirect rule, basically ruling by what was said through the elite, right? And then we saw during the, a lot we have written, and I have myself written about how in neoliberal era, neocolonialism works through inclusion, but it doesn't do indirect rule necessarily through the elite. It is actually including the everyday people by the, so I say inclusion or participation becomes an alibi of exclusion. So you dominate people, you exclude them by the idea that you are included in the process. This was a participatory process, and therefore you can justify that you have excluded them. So this, I call it symbolic inclusion and material exclusion that happens at the same times. And that is the characteristic and maybe has been the success of neoliberalism, that did the indirect rule, not necessarily through the elite, but through everybody by feeling that they were included in the process. So the inclusion becomes an alibi of exclusion. But I see that now really we are at the edge of a very different era. It's no longer domination through inclusion. We are at the edge of fascism. I mean, Moody and Trump and Bolsonaro, I mean, this is not an era where they are even trying to include. They are basically building the walls and saying, we don't want these extras, those who are not directly commodifying. So we need to think, in a different way. Maybe the language of neocolonialism has to be more reflective of what is happening now, that more than ever before, this is no longer directly, ruling through inclusion, but obvious and direct cutting out and exclusion. And I see it more, what we need to think about is anti-colonial practices. We have to basically think about where do we find practices of anti-colonialism, anti-racist, anti-sexist, patriarchal, and anti-capitalism. And I don't want to, without wanting to essentialize women or indigeneity, but one of the phrases that I like about Vandana Shiva, going back to her, she talked about maybe those people who were excluded, actually she talks about them as intellectual gene pools of thought and action. The very people who were not included in the project of kind of colonial inclusion, they had to find ways of surviving without being through the project, right, of inclusion. And therefore maybe those are the subordinate people, are people who we should go back to and look for inspiration for anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-sexist practices. And there might be some aspiration and hope for being able to confront this, what is happening now, which is very aggressive and I stop there.
I think there's something good about this book. Now I have ideas. Two things came to my mind listening to the entire line is that we are indeed in fascist times. We have Sisi in Egypt. Can't just. I'm here to remind you. Too many to keep track of. And in fact, this reminds me that maybe it's. I'm being optimistic. I think this is the time where we can actually decolonize a lot of what we have inherited also. I think we have stripped colonization from the Western, and we have taken it to internally as an identity, even though even in Egypt we have it that says you become Malik after Malik. You become the owner more than the owner, the owner. So, and this is very clear in the practices, in the local practices, and even on the regional practice in Egypt. But one thing that that struck me when I was working is that we are no longer seeing binaries. Binaries are being kept like in the back when direct violence is needed. But what is being projected to us is actually a continuum. So, for example, in Egypt, we don't have formal and informal anymore. We have a graded list of what is called unplanned until you reach the extreme danger. You have 4 other danger levels, and then you have the formality also graded. So it's not entirely formal or informal because the informalities generated by the government has been put on the table. So no one can claim formal, informal anymore. So the government was quite interestingly intelligent to come up in 2008 with this entire spectrum of unsafe areas and unplanned areas, thanks to the GIZ, the German development organization. But then, also parallel to this kind of spectrum, we have a very clear active ruination. The way that they deal with spaces, urban spaces, whether it's one of the spot that lies on the spectrum, or whether in the new mega projects, like we have what, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the website, but it's called Ruin Tour, because we have many mega projects that are left desolate. They are there because of the imperatives of the real estate, but they are in ruin. They date back to the 90s, to the early 21st century, and they are amazing buildings, but in ruin. That aside, we have also an active ruination when it comes to the spectrum of unplanned or unplanned areas. So this process of actively ruining space and leaving it to freeze, maybe we'll use it later, maybe freezing will actually increase, of course, its real estate value. Fine, there is a contradiction of having so many dead assets, if you're speaking the language of the neocolonialism. However, these dead assets are part of the neocolonial system, are part of the neoliberal process of turning everything into real estate. It's not just physical real, but also it's financial. It's a financial asset. It's a financial tool that can generate more money by being ruined. So this contradiction of producing much more revenue, very quick revenue out of ruins, is something that we need to explore. What struck me as very, very interesting is the participation of the urban dwellers in ruining as well. How they started also becoming part of the space, the physicality of the space, and also the identity in ruin. And that is why I actually wanted to say that when we reclaim dignity, it's actually reclaiming issues that living in a ruined place can actually produce a ruined identity. And an identity that speaks, and even talking about the future, it's very interesting. And I think we have a chance here to capture it, because I have never seen in my, at least in my short life, I've never seen neoliberalism prized over, especially. The last thing I would say is within those spaces of ruins, whether we're talking about the new mega projects that are left deserted as fixed or as dead assets, frozen, or the ones that are actively being ruined inside old Cairo or elsewhere. There's an interesting thing that is the idea of living heritage, and the idea of the relationship between urban dwellers, the local authorities, local contractors, and the non-human aspect and it's not, I'm not talking about the physicality of the built environment, I'm talking about animals, plants, birds, fruit trees, all sorts of stuff that grows naturally within the urban ruin. And it's interesting to see that even local dwellers are now coming up with very exciting businesses that transcend national boundaries in breeding, in ownership of pets, in illegal sales of pets in certain types of. So I think also this is an element that maybe if we study it carefully, that there might lie some seed of decolonizing, getting back our direct and intimate relationship with nature, which was the original sin of having to capture nature to produce what we know now as the urban. So.
Oh, the box keeps open and open and open. Again, a couple of things that I think are present in the different interventions. Forms of coloniality and decolonizing. Of course, they're very clear through the material work, in particular related to land and property, and individual property, right? So I think a way, well, that's actually clear how that's playing out in our cities. And let me just take advantage of this to say that this is, we know, is not just something happening in the Global South. So this is also a call for the conference that we're here in the so-called Global North, with a lot of scholars coming from all over the world, but also working from here, etc. So I think we need to keep that in mind too, that of course that, again, as with time, with space, we are talking about different scales all the time, as you know better than I do. So in that dialogue, of course, real estate is all over, and we're talking about global actors, and some of those originated from the north, but also many of those, and in particular these days, and from the BRICS, originated from the south. So transnational companies like Cemex in Mexico, the cement producer, that is one of the few companies that actually produce cement in the world. I think there are 5. So we're very used to hear about Monsanto, right, and Walmart and all these guys. I'm sorry for the commercial, but we are not so used to hear about where are those in terms of planning, business and companies. The legal teams linked to them, they're actually the same, and they are all together. The companies doing marketing for them, and so on, and the ones producing the basic materials that you need to actually do the buildings, right? And this is very important. This is very important in both, I mean, at different levels, of course, in the terms of the materiality of that, in terms of the legality and legitimacy of that, and in terms of the different economies that will provoke or support or not, right? So resisting that, and there are many ways of resisting that, and of course, I mean, through history, and part of that we all know is collective, traditional forms of ownership and uses, so not just ownership, because as you know, for many, in particular indigenous cosmovisions all over the world, we're just here passing through, right? So what kind of right we have to actually own something in this planet that we're just passing through, right? Even as a species, not just as human beings in a particular life. So questioning ownership and having and deconstructing and reconstructing different relationships with the place we live in, right? So for example, that would traduce in very contemporary human rights as the right to housing rights, but not the property rights, right? Housing rights are not the same as property rights, and this is very important in terms of the contents, in terms of the legality and legitimacy of that, and so on. So collective and traditional forms, but not only property, but also the ways we build and the materials we use. So if you look at the different codes in different places, and I'm sure this is true also to some extent for the Global North, many of those both traditional materials, so they're local materials, right, that you get from around and you don't need to ship in from far away, and the traditional techniques, they're both criminalized, penalized, or invisibilized. Is that a coincidence? We all know it's not a coincidence. So resisting in a very concrete way is actually bringing those forward and visualizing those and trying to reconstruct those and make those possible. So those are kind of the things the groups we're working with, both in the Global South and in the North, are doing. So community land trusts, housing cooperatives, federations, federations of user, public community partnerships, public social partnerships, and not public-private partnerships, right? Or private-private partnerships. So all those kind of things. And if you look at both the new urban agenda, because we're also talking about the international level, and the role of multilateral international organizations. So if we're living in a world of global corporations, so there is a role for the multilateral organizations to play, and we should be claiming them to play that role, right? And not just protecting business. So this is a critical topic. We can discuss that later on too. But so the role of the UN, for example, and if you look at both the SDGs and the SDG 11 in particular, and the New Urban Agenda, because of civil society and social movements advocacy, you will now find that these things are incorporated there. So to actually fighting climate change in particular, recovering and supporting and promoting and visibilizing both local materials and traditional techniques. So this means very practically changing the building codes and changing also the legal arrangements for property and use of property in different countries. So I invite you to take a look at that and actually try to use that, because if we push for that to be included, if we don't push for that to be implemented, nobody else is going to do that, right? Thank you.
Thank you for all of your comments. I just wanted to draw out some of what you said to see if we can, in terms of sort of generating that learning that will take us forward over the next 3 days. What's been very striking is there's clearly both continuity and discontinuity, as you would expect. I think what's been very interesting is sort of the continuity around elite power, right? The lock is the same. The keys, owners of the keys have changed. That's quite a nice metaphor. I might have to steal that for teaching. But this particular question of how the neoliberal developmentalism, if we can call it that, has shaped how we think about inclusion and exclusion, that mirage of inclusion, when in fact it's about creating certain new types of exclusion. And certainly in the context of thinking about the urban. But I'm really glad that you talked about the global north, because this is a real bugbear of mine. This and I understand that this is a sort of a knowledge network that's talking about the global south. But an abiding frustration I have is the othering that happens in the discourse itself. And it's something that I think as a lesson, as scholars and activists, in my own work and thinking about development studies as a set of ideas or practices, I'm very keen for us to move on from that. What are the lessons for these sorts of issues around urbanization for northern spaces? Why are we talking about the rights to housing and homelessness in Toronto or London? Why don't those lessons matter? And if there are forms of resistance, why aren't we talking about them in the context of housing cooperatives in parts of Europe or the US, right? So we had the special rapporteur in poverty talking about the US and the gross levels of inequality around access to housing, tied up with some of the colonial legacies around land, and then of course this sort of opening up of neoliberalism, as you say, in the way that land itself is being reimagined in terms of either as a continuity of land as the sort of central focus of the colonial enterprise, but also as a form of disruption as we reimagine that engagement with land. So I think there's so many things there. And so it kind of actually leads very well on, because I think, because we're aiming to end at 11, so I think what I'll do is I'll ask sort of one more substantive question, and it sort of tries to build on some of the currents that have come out of the things that you've said around forms of resistance, sort of opening up challenges to neoliberalism, sort of being able to name the sort of elite forms of power and then what we do about them. And I suppose it builds on the kind of question which I imagine all of you at some point in your teaching and your activism get asked, right? So whether it's younger or mature students who come along, or activists and volunteers who come along and say, well, that's great because I really understand the problem much better, but what on earth do I do about it now? What do I do now? We had MA students do that to us one year. Well, the MA was great. I feel like I understand, and now I need another MA to know the solutions. I felt quite sad in a way, just because I sort of thought that really wasn't, I didn't mean to make you sad, but that's sort of how it turned out. But there is something important about saying, okay, you know, and that reflexivity is important, but that outward looking, what do we do about this now? And that's what I'd like. And one of the things that strikes me is I'd like to bring in some of the things that you've talked about, and there are issues close to my heart around knowledge, alternative forms of knowledge, knowledge validation. You've talked about poetry very eloquently. We've had sort of invocations of pop culture, which we mustn't underestimate the power of those images and that messaging in shaping how we think of the world. They're absolutely crucial. And so I want to invite our panelists to consider, first of all, whether or how we are part of a solution. I'm not suggesting there's one, but just, you know, what does action look like? And whether part of that is about alternative forms of knowledge validation. So can we know the urban differently? And that's not, and I mean that in the narrow academic sense, right? So that, you know, sort of maybe questioning the peer review publication, the PDF, and moving beyond that, so the things about poetry. But that broader sense of knowing, reimagining urban spaces, reimagining engagement with land, with property. So any aspect of that would be wonderful to hear your thoughts on with regard to shaping the conflict.
I'm going to begin with my own space, really, as a teacher who teaches courses in habitat studies, courses around housing, courses around social theory of cities, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge because how does one portray, in some ways, you begin. So first of all, our continuity with the colonial thing, where I teach a postgraduate course in English to a bunch of people who are trained through different disciplines in a context where the urban and its professionalization has also been commanded by particular disciplines. So urban planning, urban engineering. So all municipal institutions are engineering. All policy-making institutions are planners. And you have policymakers who are economists, right? So it is these kind of things within which, how does one place these alternatives, right? At one level, you want students to be exposed to these hegemonic ideas. At the same time, also begin to engage with a different idea and a notion of what is the urban. At one, exposing them to the fact that India, when we think about cities, are not just Mumbai, Pune, Delhi and Bangalore, which are the metro cities, but that this is a land of 6 lakh villages with 8,500 urban areas, where the definition of urban areas itself is contested. So taking students through these contestations, at the same time also making them aware that the current urban is so very embedded in its scales of thinking about the local, the regional, the national, the global. And I think, to me, those are the interesting parts of teaching and thinking through with students. When students especially come from different parts of the region, giving them confidence to speak, to talk, and at the same time also have the humility to engage, because this kind of a division of the educated with the ones who are engaged in practice. So introducing those kind of exercises, making them essentially part of the entire pedagogy of education. At research, it's the third dimension, and I'll stop my reflection there. In terms of where do you want to learn? Is it the theory that I have grown up with as a teacher? Or is it also making partnership with and understanding with the different concepts which are emerging in the global south itself, which are very interesting, with conditions which are much more relevant to the particular historic movement of urbanization that we are all going through. These are not the challenges of urbanization which were faced in the colonial era. This is a different movement with different challenges altogether. And if one has to think about this, how does one make connections? With whom? Where are the resources to do that? And how does one make those connections? I think these, are challenges for me as a researcher, definitely.
So I want to go back to the first picture that I had shown you. So I showed that picture once at a job talk, and needless to say, many people were not impressed, in the sense that I could tell from the look on their faces that they were disgusted that this could be what the urban could look like. And that, again, I think, goes back to how we even imagine the urban, like what we prioritize as the aesthetic of the urban, right? And so the reason why I keep going back to that picture that I showed you, and even Wakanda, is because it goes back to, I think it was what Lorena was saying in terms of, what she was saying in terms of local materials, traditional techniques. So these shanty megastructures that were in Olale Kanjayefi's pictures, that's how, when you don't have a lot of money, that's how you build your house, and they're sustainable practices, right? So, and not to romanticize particular spaces, there's also like the solidarity economies, right? So like, what is wrong with having that way of living, with having, with thinking about the future like that? So, but yeah, so to me, I think that's important when we think about how we can know the urban differently, right? And how we can reimagine the urban, how it's really important to take into account local context. That really matters, and that's also why I like Wakanda. I mean, Wakanda has certain issues too in itself, but even in terms of how people move about, like this is their everyday. This is like valuing market spaces, how people interact, not necessarily having luxurious spaces like malls, as to having places that's just, I mean, again, I'm trying very hard not to romanticize, but that's just inclusive, where you don't have to think, oh, I can't really go to that mall because I'm not like that, but it's like, it's the outdoors. You're just, you're using the space without also, and in Wakanda, they also take into account nature as well. They didn't necessarily just get rid of nature, found ways to make things work. So to me, I think that's really important, taking into account what you mentioned, local materials, traditional techniques, and not being limited to how we currently think of what the urban should look like. And this is what development and progress looks like, right?
Thank you. Okay, so what can be done, right? That was the broader question. And I think Clyde Wood, geographer, has a saying that says we as academics have become excellent coroners, that we can detect the time and cause of death perfectly, but we can't say anything about how could the death have been prevented. So I think, this is a very important question about what does it mean and what can we do with all this that we have kind of talked about here. So I want to emphasize that maybe the place to go for inspiration and thinking about what can be what can be done and what can we do is, again, going back to the practices of subordinate groups, because they did not buy into the project of inclusion, and maybe they were never intended to be included. And I call it insurgent practices of subordinate groups. And insurgent practices, what I mean by those that they do not necessarily want a bigger share or a share of the pie, they want a different kind of pie altogether. So if we call that anti-hegemonic, it is not wanting to be included in project of capitalism or included, by having a bigger share of it, but they definitely want a different world, a different kind of society. And that is what I mean by insurgent practices of subordinate groups. So these are groups that are well seasoned, they have experience, historically have had experience in that. And I think for us now that maybe in Global North is a newer thing to face the moment where things are falling apart and there is much for us to learn. So if we brought it to more concrete of, okay, so what do I do with it as an educator in the audience, or myself as an educator, or as an activist, I want to say a couple of things. As an educator, definitely by legitimizing in our ways of teaching, different ways of knowing and doing, and incorporating, including range of voices, the range of, epistemic ways of, different epistemologies by kind of, in my own teaching, for example, I include insurgent practices of South African anti-eviction activists, right? And I call it practices of planning, because they are the ones who are more effective in building our cities and urban than professionally trained planners, who maybe what they plan and say doesn't go far, but it is the protest in the street and various creative and performing acts of insurgency by those anti-addiction activists that make actually things happen in the city. So in my own teaching, I bring those epistemologies, ways of knowing and doing, into the classroom and in our education that we have. And in terms of, for activists, I think it is very important. I have only one kind of thing that I have been thinking about and I would like to share, and that is the warning about how, again, this neo-colonial era we are in is very, capitalism is very creative. If there is one thing we know about it, is that it's excellent, perfected the art of being able to fold in whatever is outside it and is opposition to it. I always talk to my students about t-shirts of Che Guevara being sold in size small, medium, and large, and extra large in supermarkets of Cape Town. And it doesn't matter that it's Che Guevara. If I can make money out of it, I will sell it, I will promote it, right? So I think the activists and NGO crowd, we also have to be very careful and very conscious of the ability of capitalism of turning us into slave activism, what Marcelo Swirsky calls it, slave activism. That is basically activists that just become mediums of guaranteeing that capitalism is working, or racism is working, or patriarchy is working. And we don't want to be those underpaid, overworked activists that are not challenging the pie itself. And that is where, again, by going to thinking about what was said here, we don't want to have a bigger share of the real estate or housing. We want maybe a different future that is not based on private property. And if we are going for that different future, daring to imagine a different future, it has to be an anti-capitalism in its root, and then, anti-sexism, all of those things, that we are imagining something that is not, is beyond what we know it today. And again, sharing my own experience in the classroom with my undergraduate students, I did, an exercise which I thought was very simple, 10 minutes in groups, imagine a just city, what would it be like? And it was frightening in this freshman class of, Illinois students, how they sat around each other and then they raised hand and said, it's impractical. Why should we even imagine a just city? It is not possible. Equality doesn't work. It doesn't, So and I had to keep saying, but just imagine if it was possible, and I would get resistance, right? And I talk to my classroom about how those imaginative muscles have gone dormant because we have been so much told the Tina effect. There is no alternative to this. And kind of that is why I see as activists and as educators, we have to really try to not turn into that, trying to find a bigger piece of what it is, but dare to imagine and work towards something that is completely different. And I call that humane urbanism. Being inspired by provocation by Audre Lorde, I also call it sometimes erotic urbanism. She makes a distinction between eroticism as deep caring and deep sharing, as opposed to pornography. And I think that is the kind of cities and urbanism that we aspire to, something that is not temporary, conditional, commodified, but deeper way of caring and sharing. that we have to first be able to imagine it and believe that we can get it. Thank you.
Well, I must say, when the question was asked, are we part of the solution? Yes, of course, we are part of the solution as long as we're alive. Because I'm a product of an American academia, and then I shifted to India, in a public university in India, and then I coming back to Egypt. I can't say surprised would be an understatement, that I'm teaching undergrads who don't even know that Egypt had Abdel Nasser. Yeah, they don't even know the history, the modern history of 1952. And when I try even working through glossaries, and the idea of the commons, for example, contested at Adeniyi, it never crossed their mind. They don't know what does that mean. Because these are the products of a specific 30 years of. So, yeah, we are the solution, but I'm sorry we're brought back to square one of having to re-talk about. At the very same time, we have the organizations, because of course Egypt is one of those very fruitful and a place where most of international organizations work with. And we are proud to be the second one after Quito to have translated the new urban agenda into the roadmap. I was part of it. And I can tell you where it is now. It's trying to hold my stack with the entire. So it's the idea is we have trends going on. We have students, young as they may be, who know nothing about what history is, what conflict is, what the possibilities are. Struggles like the Che Guevara, for them they don't even know us. Yes. And I'm not exaggerating, by the way. Omnia is here and she can also support what I'm saying. So this is something that at the same time I have colleagues, graduates, Abdel Nasser, unlike India, they focus on physical planning, not on economic planning per se. So the majority was physical planning. So we have physical planners who date back to the 1960s who cannot think of alternatives or even parallels. So finding out that I came back to Egypt in 2017 and finding out that there has been no attempt in academia to even compile the research done on urban. The first thing I saw in India was the Mira Kosampi's urban studies. So yeah, we're from scratch, but the scratch here is even worse than before because we are in the fascist. Yeah, and here the urban is presenting itself, actually manifesting itself in multiple forms. Insurgency, yes, James Holston was famous to say the insurgent citizenship. I say defiance because there is no one single enemy. Local communities are now exploring, even living around the new urban gated communities, which are extremely posh suburbs. You go there and you find every day queues and queues and queues of poor coming to work. And they are enjoying foreigners, they're enjoying the idea that they're seeing rich people, how they behave. So I think, yeah, the urban is by force, is presenting itself, is manifesting through multiple forces, including international organizations who are also speaking on inclusion, but have never presented, at least in Egypt, has rarely presented a situation where there can be a demarginalization or even moving the center.
Thank you. Yeah, we can keep going and going and going for hours. Hopefully we can continue these conversations with you all during the conference. A couple of things again, I tried to be brief because I took too long before. One, I think it's important to be aware and very conscious all the time that the invisibilization of alternative, or the other way around, the production of the discourse of there is no alternatives is a production and takes a lot of time and energy from the system and from the status quo to actually maintain that. For us, we will think that it's something that is there and they don't have anything to do, they don't need to do more because it's already there, but actually it's constantly being produced. The idea that there is no alternatives, and not only that, but this is the only way possible, right? So being aware of that, I think, is important. And of course, inside that, the role of universities is key, right? So also being aware of that role and reproducing or questioning and deconstructing all that is critical. Everywhere, not just in the Global South, but also in the Global North, and in particular because many of the theories still today, although that's changing and it's changing very quickly, in particular in the past 20 years or so, but still many of the theories that are being applied, in particular in planning, but not only, of course, we can talk about macroeconomics and all that, and technology and all that, coming from and being important from the North, right? And usually being sanctified, or, because they're coming from scientific knowledge, and that scientific knowledge is being produced by universities or recognized and very well funded think tanks and so on. So I think that's important. There is a materiality of that, right? And there are institutions, there are a lot of money, and there are people involved, and so on. And the other thing, of course, linked to what I was saying already by the colleagues here, is this idea of otherwise, so doing otherwise, thinking otherwise, feeling otherwise, being otherwise, is basically acknowledging other knowledges, and what is the knowledge actually, what we mean by knowledge, and we know this is a project of modernity, there is only one way of knowledge, and that's linked to reason and so on and so forth. So questioning that, but it's not enough questioning that. I think we need to create the spaces, and the spaces being not just material, but the possibility of dialogue and conversation, and believing again that through dialogue, in a very deep, profound way, is that we create new knowledges, and knowledges that are embedded, they are in particular places, in particular bodies, particular times, but also they can speak to each other, right? Because we also have the challenge of particularism, right? And how we overcome that. And it's not just possible to do that through English. In particular, if we want to imagine otherwise, right? And also remember that what we call now, what is called, we don't call them like that, we call them social production of habitat, but what is called informal cities or slums or etc., marginal, they were part of the reality in the Global North. And actually until very recently, in the mid-20th century, right? So we're not talking about 2,000 years ago, and we're not talking something that is only in the south, in the periphery, right? That was part of the reality here. So, and that was a project to erase that, and erasing that, erase culture, erase history, erase other possibilities. So, I think being aware and trying to be part of the glue that will connect that, because they want us disconnected. And they want the knowledge to keep this connected, right? And you talk about the sectorialism, particularism of the knowledge. That's reproduced at the government level, of course, we all know that, at the public policy level, and also at the movements level, right? Because we have sectorial claims. And that's not working, right? That's why we're trying to build bigger platforms and bigger spaces for dialogue and getting together and putting the struggles together and understanding and imagining shared utopias of caring and being together in this planet. Thank you very much.
We'll draw it to a close. We're 7 minutes over time. But I do think that, first I want to say thank you so much to all our panelists, who I think deserve another round of applause. I think if you're all half as inspired as I'm feeling, it's going to be a great 3 days. But what's really amazing is just the heterogeneity of ideas that you've presented us with, lots of food for thought, and I'm absolutely confident that it's all going to get discussed in lots more depth in the next 3 days. So are we having, is it a break now, or? So we're having a short break. Can I point people to refreshment? Outside. And just to say thank you very much.